Good morning. My name is Michael Carey. I'm the chair of the Housing Agency. Welcome to the Housing Agency's Housing Conference 2020. We're all participating in this conference in a very different manner to previous years, and we're all doing our work in very different ways to previous years. And despite the enormous difficulties that COVID-19 pandemic has posed for the work of the local authorities, the approved housing bodies, the state bodies and the wider sector in delivering on our housing commitments, we can all be very proud of how this housing sector has risen to the challenge in the past 10 months. Some of the housing challenges have changed and intensified in the context of COVID, and your individual responses have been in many cases extraordinary, and we've made some really good progress. I'd like to personally commend you on the important work that you have been doing and wish you all the very best for what is hopefully the last phase in this pandemic. Today, in a very different format to our usual annual housing conference, we begin a week-long schedule of virtual webinars focused on some of the key issues affecting our housing sector. In the coming days, the housing conference will address homelessness prevention, housing affordability, and sustainable communities. Today, we open with a broad discussion on the key challenges in the social housing sector in developing economies, and I'm delighted that we're joined by a panel of distinguished speakers, each of which are experts in their fields. In a few moments, we'll have an opening address from the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage, Dara O'Brien TD. Then Wilhelm Medema, senior economist at the OECD Social Policy Division, will discuss a recent policy brief on social housing in OECD countries. That will be followed by Sorcha Edwards, Secretary General of Housing Europe, who will discuss social housing in a European context. And finally, we'll have a session by John O'Connor, our own Chief Executive at the Housing Agency, who will touch on the issues of housing in an Irish context and how we seek to address them in the coming years. Following these contributions, the session will be open to you, to your questions, to be asked to the panel. I would ask you to address your questions in the question section on the control panel on the right of your screen. The administrators will control those and feed those to us, and we will hopefully get through as many as possible in the last session of this webinar. Just one housekeeping issue, technical issues. If there are any technical issues, we advise that you come out of the webinar and re-enter it using the same link that you've used just now. If that doesn't work, then please send a message on the question section, starting with the word tech, and our team will pick it up and come back to you directly to help you solve your problem. So without any further delays, let us get started, and let us begin with today's webinar with an address from the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage, Dara O'Brien TD. Thank you.
Accordia, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to open this year's Housing Agency Conference in a slightly different circumstances than we might have envisaged. Firstly, I'd really like to thank the Chair, Mr. Michael Carey, and the Board of the agency for your invitation. These occasions are really important, even more so in the current climate. They offer us the time to share experiences, to learn from each other, to ask questions, and to explore the best practices in relation to housing. I particularly welcome the themes of the individual sessions over the week ahead. Key challenges, preventing homelessness, a really important one, housing affordability, sustainable communities, and build your career in housing. They're all hugely relevant and are sure to be informative and productive for presenters and participants alike. I'd like to acknowledge the extremely valuable work of everyone in the Housing Agency in providing really essential support and expertise through your vast range of housing related services and which you provide to my own department, local authorities and other stakeholders, and indeed partners involved in addressing our housing challenge. The workload of the agency has really increased substantially in recent years, which I believe is a testament to your value and indeed your capabilities. There is, however, much more work to do and more progress to be made. It will be through a continued positive and collaborative working relationship between all stakeholders and partners that will make more progress across the housing agenda. As a government, we believe that everybody should have access to good quality homes to purchase or rent at an affordable price. And my mission as Minister is to drive this vision.
Attendees, our apologies. We've had some technical glitches with the video and we're endeavouring to fix that, and we're going to restart the video right now. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to invite back Michael Carey. Unfortunately, we're unable to play that video to the full extent that we would have wished it to from the Minister. Michael, back over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, and apologies for the technical problem there. I think we can probably all give the first half of the Minister's speech now, having listened to it a few times, but apologies for the technical glitch. Let's move back to the live event and go on to our first speaker. Wilhelm Adima is Senior Economist at the OECD Social Policy Division. Wilhelm leads a team of analysts working on family, children and housing policies and is responsible for a number of OECD databases, including the Affordable Housing Database. Wilhelm and his colleagues have produced a range of publications on social housing themes for the OECD, including on policies to promote access to good quality and affordable housing. Recently, he has co-authored the OECD policy brief, Social Housing, a Key Part of Past and Future Housing Policy. Wilhelm, you're very welcome. Thank you for taking time out to join us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. First of all, thanks very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the presentations by my colleagues, and I was looking forward to the video by the Minister, but the one good thing about it is that I wasn't the only one with technical problems over the last earlier this morning with the computer. Again, thanks very much for having me. And what I intend to do, next slide, please, over the next few minutes, exactly, is to have a little look at what social housing is. You know that far better than I do, but just pointing to some differences in concept across the OECD, looking at at how big the sector is across countries and how countries compare to each other in that sense. Despite all these differences, there are common challenges that OECD countries face, and of course, we have all been affected by the pandemic, and that has also had an important impact on the operation of housing policies and certain measures of support. And I would like to end up with some words on that particular issue. In terms of what is social housing, it's residential accommodation that is provided at submarket prices. Traditionally, that was often done by municipalities, by councils. Many countries have now also a very developed sector of non-government organizations, housing associations in Irish parlance, which provide social housing. And this traditional sort of social housing in Ireland is supplemented by dwellings that are leased from private owners and allocated to recipients of housing allowances. You see in other countries different concepts as well. In Germany, you have social housing obligations and eligibility and rent levels which are subsidized for a 20 to 30 year period, upon which the dwellings can be transferred to the private stock. And then you have the model of municipal housing in Sweden, which we have included here, whereas some Swedes may argue that that isn't totally correct. But for the international comparison, we have included the Swedish municipal housing in this sector. Next slide, please. Then to have a look at the size of social housing across countries, there's only a few countries where the social housing sector is considered to be large. And these three countries are the Netherlands, Denmark, and Austria. Whereas in the United Kingdom, the stock of social housing has fallen below 20% of the total housing stock. You can see that Ireland is also in the moderate group at about 12-13%, but that in most of the OECD countries, the social housing stock is either small or very small, which means that in these countries, the entrants, the people who are living in social housing are very much targeted by policy and often belong to the very bottom of the income distribution. Next slide, please. One of the interesting trends that that we've been able to see particularly since the great financial crisis in 2008-2009, is that there has been a slowdown in public investment in housing development. Whereas spending on housing allowances across the OECD, this chart is an average for 25 OECD countries, spending on housing allowances has held up over the years. You can see that direct investment in housing development, the purple part of the bar, has fallen considerably. And that brings us to the challenges that the social housing sector is currently facing. Next slide, please. As you see, the first challenge is the decline in public investment of recent years. Another challenge is to maintain and upgrade the current stock. The quality of social housing often suffers in various areas. I mean, if you for instance look at Latvia, where we did a report earlier this year, 20% of the municipal dwelling stock is not used because it's just not of sufficient quality. The housing units, 80%, 75-80% of the housing units in Australia are deemed and managed by indigenous housing units, are deemed below acceptable standards. So there's a considerable housing issue there. 20% of the tenants are unhappy with the standards of their home. Same thing in France. 15% of the residents are unhappy or dissatisfied with the standards of the dwelling they're living in. And at the same time, you will see that there's a push towards improvement of the quality of housing, the Green Deal in Europe. So more investment will be needed to upgrade the current stock. The other big issue for social housing is, as we've seen, lots of countries have a very small social housing sector. The three countries like the Netherlands and Austria and Denmark try to get a big group as possible in the social housing stock, so that you don't necessarily concentrate all poverty in social housing, but you establish a certain social mix. But that is increasingly difficult as targeting is becoming increasingly the norm. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then of course, in this day and age, the impact of COVID on social and affordable housing trends. I mean, it's we don't have full evidence. Of course, it's way too early for that. But there are certain things which are already coming to the fore. Again, the quality of housing is important, and what we've seen is that people living in overcrowded conditions have higher rates of infection, and the evidence is starting to come out on this. Don't know how that holds for Ireland, but the French and evidence for France and the UK are already indicating that infection rates in these poorer areas with more social housing are considerably higher than elsewhere. And of course, the longer term effect is that the economic impact of the pandemic will increase housing insecurity among a large group of people, and that will also in future increase the demand for social and affordable housing. So that means that there will be increased pressure on governments to increase investment in social and affordable housing. Now, during the pandemic, lots of governments have introduced temporary measures. Mortgage holidays, eviction bans are the most common types of support. Next slide, please. But there is a range of other measures you can think of. Now, this table is a preliminary one. We have sent it to countries for them to comment on, and so that we can publish an updated version later this year or early next year. So the information here is probably incomplete, but it gives you a feel for the measures various governments have taken. As I said, eviction postponements or bans have been introduced in a large number of countries, including Ireland. And the mortgage holiday, so to speak, is also among the more popular of measures, with also an Irish which is also applied in Ireland. There's been considerable emergency support to provide shelter for the homeless in a range of countries, including Ireland, and it will be important to sustain that after COVID-19. I know that's topic of a different theme, but it's important nonetheless. I would like to emphasize that here. Next slide, please. So some policy conclusions. The measures that were introduced with the pandemic cannot be sustained on a long-term basis. They have to be phased out, but they should be phased out once the conditions allow to do so. The reduction in public investment in affordable and social housing after the greater financial crisis has to be reversed. In our view, there is space for greater investment and so in social and affordable housing. And yeah, one of the big challenges for which there is no one-size-all or a single simple solution is to find the right balance in supporting a social mix and avoiding stigmatization and developing of ghettos, to use that word, and while at the same time making sure that you actually get your support to those households most in need. My last slide, please. The social housing brief, which we got out a couple of weeks ago, is part of a wider OECD package of work on housing and affordable housing. Mr. Carey already referred to the affordable housing database, which we continue, which we update continuously throughout the year. We've had briefs on homelessness. One is due on affordable housing, together with colleagues in the economics department, the tax department, the environment department. We're working on a synthesis piece, the OECD housing synthesis report. And next year, we're also hoping to work on a policy brief on housing for the disabled. So there's a wide range of OECD work on housing, and we are aware and we recognize the importance of this topic. So I'm looking forward to working with many of you in future and to continue to work on the housing issue as its importance is becoming increasingly visible to many policymakers around the OECD. Thank you very much, and I hope I can take some questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Thank you for your work and for the content that you've presented there. Clearly, there is huge value in us in Ireland gaining as deep a level of insight into the trends and information around the globe on social housing issues, and your data and knowledge is hugely valuable to us. Thank you for sharing, and we'll come back to you with some questions in a little while. Our second speaker today is Sorcha Edwards. Sorcha joined the Housing Europe team in 2003. She's Secretary General and Energy Coordinator and is in charge of Housing Europe's Energy Expert Network, which brings together experts from 20 national housing federations across Europe. She's led the Power House Europe project, an initiative aimed at creating national and European platforms for key stakeholders in order to promote energy efficiency and sustainable energy in housing. Sorcha is currently coordinating the Powerhouse Nearly Zero Energy Challenge project. And Sorcha, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out. We look forward to hearing what you have to say to us. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. The sound and all of that is working?
Perfect.
Yes, very good. I'll open my slides just now. That'll be the next test. Very nice to be here today, and also I'd like to echo your words in a way. You spoke about how proud you were to be working for the sector, and I have to say I very much echo that, because we've really seen how the housing associations across Europe and in Ireland have really been outperforming themselves, because in the way they have been working for residents, obviously preventing exclusion, but also reaching out, really going beyond, really reaching out to vulnerable groups and maintaining an excellent service. So I'm really proud to work for the sector. As Willem said, we don't yet see the full impact, full economic impact, but for the moment, the activities are very strong throughout Europe. So I want to continue in the same vein as Willem to talk a little bit about the challenges, and then I'm going to focus on a few of the inspiring examples coming from the sector, and talk about a little bit about the optimal enabling environment to make sure those inspiring examples can actually be multiplied. So I'm going to try opening the PowerPoint. If you...
Sorcha, I've actually shared your PowerPoint, so it's visible to everyone. So if you just want to tell me when to move the next slide on, I can do that for you.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks a lot. Is that the right size and everything now? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so you can go on. Yes, so the obviously the big challenge that has not been addressed and is really affecting too many of us is the ongoing high price of housing. You can go on. It is still one of the biggest expenditures for Europeans, and more worryingly, you can go on to the next slide. More worryingly is that 40% of those people in poverty are actually, so 4 out of 10 Europeans who are actually in poverty are paying more than 40% of their income on housing. You can go on to the next slide, Gemma. Even a couple more. What we also, the ongoing worrying trend is the territorial divide. So the fact that the supply of affordable housing is not where it needs to be, and there's no easy way to solve it. And then the next slide really shows, so the following 2 slides, the next slide really shows where the crucial problem is, and this is outlined also in the OECD report, is obviously we wouldn't be worried if the house prices were growing in line with income, but this is where the brunt of the problem is that the incomes are not growing at the same pace as house prices, and this trend has not been impacted as by COVID, and it in fact may even become more extreme. So if you go on a little bit, next slide. So what we have very much seen as a result of this pandemic, and I think the work of OECD is particularly welcomed by the sector, because we have really seen that individual welfare is not enough. We are all linked. Our individual health is not enough. We have seen this pandemic has shown how the common welfare is what we should be aiming at, and individual welfare is not enough. And the inequalities are, addressing inequalities has become even higher on the agenda. The need to address inequalities for the sake of a resilient society. And these inequalities have been even particularly clear within the housing sector. And that's why the work of OECD, which obviously is a key reference point for governments when it comes to devising their housing strategy, it's very important the recognition that has been given to the sector. We were very happy to welcome Angel Gurria, Secretary General of OECD, at our annual conference this year, with that key message and the launch of the report that Willem referred to there at the end of his PowerPoint. And he said, to build back better, we need renewed investment in the housing stock. And what was also crucial was a recognition of the fact of the diversity of the stock, and also a recognition that in many countries, while Willem did mention that in many countries within the OECD region, the stock of social or affordable cooperative housing is very small. In many countries, it actually forms up to 20–30% of the housing system and plays quite a different role. And we saw this recognition of the structural role that can be played by social housing providers was recognized in that report, which we welcome. And it actually, Ankel's words were echoed by our co-chair at that time. Our co-chair was Sally from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, and she really called for a new positive framing of the housing system with social justice at the centre. And our newly elected chair, the chair of the Danish Federation of Social Housing Association, stressing the affordable and social housing must not be a last resort, but part of the mainstream. So very strong and clear messages there coming, and as I said, the recognition from the OECD of the diversity of the sector and the different role it can play, not as a last resort, but also as a central piece of the housing system in some member states is crucial. Go on to the next slide, please, and we see that also at European level, we obviously know that the EU does not have competence on housing, while quite a few of its policies do have an indirect impact. And we will have the vote tomorrow of the report on access to decent and affordable housing for all, an own initiative report from Kim van Sparentak. And we also have quite a significant report from the sector on the renovation wave from Irish MEP Kieran Cuff, who will be speaking at your event over the next couple of days as well. We have also a growing recognition from on the potential role of the sector from the broader the different departments of the European Commission. Dietrich Sampson, for instance, who actually lives in a social housing dwelling in the Netherlands himself, and the European Economic and Social Committee coming out with an opinion on universal access to housing as decent, sustainable and affordable over the long term. So we see, again, more political recognition of the real need to address this issue for the sake of our common good. So thank you. Go on to the next one. And this is what I want to really stress for the rest of the minutes that I have available, is that while we recognize the challenge and we recognize that many people are being failed by the system for a number of different reasons, and why we need to continue to gather that data, we also find that we really need to recognize what is working on the ground and to celebrate what is actually the systems that are in place and have been supporting our societies and our cities for up to 100 years in some countries. One of the ways we're doing that is what kicked off in Amsterdam, the International Social Housing Festival, and then the baton was quickly taken up by Lyon with the follow-up, and now we are working on the next one with Helsinki, the next International Social Housing Festival in 2022, to really give a chance for people to come to that city and see what the social housing and the social housing providers, the cooperative housing providers and the city itself is doing to address the housing needs and to boost innovation in the sector. And what really inspired the very first, the Amsterdam edition, was the recognition coming from international students, recognition that very often the people themselves in the country are the first to criticize a housing system and not really realizing what they have. So there were international students saying, this is amazing, we could only dream of having something like this. And this realization that actually we can be overcritical of what we have, and there's also a moment that you have to actually appreciate what is working and to celebrate that. So move on to the next one. So I will just give a couple of examples, hope the time is still fine. A couple of examples on how the those initiatives where very often the communities or the people are given a very strong say in the projects themselves, whether that'll give an example of a refurbishment project, a new build project, and an energy efficiency project. And we can very much see that this is a very strong spirit within the sector right now, that housing providers are looking to work much more with the tenants, with the residents, on co-creating projects, whether that be new build or regeneration. So that's just an example of, and in the Danish system, you have what is called a tenants democracy. So obviously this is no new example, that has been functioning for many, many decades now, where the tenants are actually managing the decisions within the housing associations, the public housing companies in Denmark, and having a say in also the design of the common spaces and the regeneration and how that takes place. And that's a picture of an estate just outside Copenhagen, where the children were actually engaged to help to design the playground. So please go on. I picked another example. This is one in Rotterdam called Space S, which I was fortunate enough to actually visit in person. There, the 200 flats, so the residents of the 200 flats, were actually involved in the process of the design and planning of the project 3 years before it was actually built. And they were obviously based on the eligibility for entrance into the eligibility for criteria for allocation of social housing. And the news went out via social media, but also via local markets and billboards. And those, now I actually was able to visit 3 years after completion, and we see that the residents there are extremely proud of where they live. It was the land was provided at a low cost by the local authority, so it's in a quite central place. There are associations working there to enable the integration of people with disabilities. We met a man who had a severe level of autism, who was actually on the management board of the Tenants Association, and because the housing provider was working together not only with the city but other associations specialized in the treatment of autism. So we could see that this project was not only tackling the affordability issue in Rotterdam, but also tackling integration aging. So you had also facilities within the building to allow aging in place, quality aging in place. It was tackling obviously gentrification by having social housing in a key point within the city, and empowerment of people with disabilities. And what was very interesting is that the housing provider actually reports that the time that goes into maintenance actually very low, because the residents themselves are taking on the bulk of that management of the common spaces and any problems that might come up. Go on to the next one, please. This is addressing one of the key problems also that Willem identified. So in situations we are looking at a low energy performance of the stock, low quality of the stock, a need for refurbishment. And this is an example again where this is coming from one of our members in Spain, so a public housing company in the north of Spain, in Bilbao, which is working with local residents, providing them with a center, a drop-in center, where people can get quality, neutral, free information about the renovation of their home. This applies not only to people living in the social housing district, but also those living in private homes in the area. So enabling the renovation of the entire stock in the district. And what is crucial again there is similar with the Rotterdam, you had an excellent collaboration. You have a strategy at the level of the region linked in with the Sustainable Development Goals. You have the right funding in place. You have the right entities, a strong, in that case, public social housing company, and you have a good partnership and a clear framework and financing framework to get the job done. If you jump on to the next one, a similar example linked to this regeneration challenge. This is part of the Million Homes project in Sweden. So in the 60s, they built 1 million homes, and many of those are in urgent need of refurbishment, and some in areas with the concentration of social issues. And how they worked there was again with the housing association and with the city and with the local associations and services, work on a neighborhood approach to bringing up the quality not only of the homes but the neighborhood itself. If you go on again. I finish up with one of the examples that has been mentioned already today, so prevention and addressing homelessness. So again, this is a shift in the way homelessness and homeless prevention is addressed, and we see all over Europe housing associations, social housing providers playing a key role, working again with local authorities to offer people a roof over their head with the accompanying necessary social services. You go on again. I'm almost finished. Yes, so this is what we see that those examples have in common. We see so the government, so EU, or that's EU, national, regional, or local, working to harness those ideas and enable those entities on the ground, whether they are community-led housing associations, as they're in Scotland, social housing providers, cooperatives, enable those with the right regulatory framework, and the right finance obviously is crucial. And obviously addressing those issues such as the rampant financialization in the sector, or issues like unregulated short-term rental. So it's really time to ensure that those entities that are capable of doing the job are actually given the right regulatory framework and finance to do it. And why we need to do this, and I think the examples that I've shown today can illustrate how, and I think it's crucial, how people can really get on board there, and we can encourage people to look beyond our own front doors and the here and now and ask, what society do we want to live in? And even if our own home is perhaps gaining in value, do we want to live in a city or a locality where there are homeless people? Do we want to live in a city where students can no longer take up a position at university because there's no affordable housing? Do we want a situation where essential workers are traveling long distances to access their place of work? These are the type of questions that need to be at the basis to get the public on board for these type of, for the way we need to go when it comes to housing. And on the next slide, we are showing one of the initiatives that we are working on also together with the housing agency. They have come in to support this initiative, the Housing 2030. It's looking at, because we know getting the housing policies right is absolutely no easy matter. So we're looking at land policies, finance policies, and governance policies that have really worked in delivering affordable social housing across Europe, and bringing those together to serve as a toolkit for policymakers who want to push more in that direction. And then the last slide, just to remind again of the huge diversity around Europe, the different types of organizations, many of them existing for even up to 100 years, but the amazing fabric of and housing traditions that we have in Europe that we can all draw from and learn from, and take the lessons that we have learned from this pandemic, the importance of housing and the importance of housing as a key part of ensuring equality, so we can take those lessons forward and learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Sorcha, thank you. Thank you very much for that contribution. Working with you and with your organisation is of huge value to all of us in the sector. Thank you for your support and your leadership. There will be time at the end of this session to take a few questions and put them to the panelists. So could I urge you, I think we've 270 people or so on this call. Can I urge you to put questions into the questions button on your control panel on the right hand side, and we'll try and select some of those questions to put to the panel after we've heard from our final speaker, John O'Connor, who you all know. John is Chief Executive at the Housing Agency. It's a great pleasure to work with you, John, over the last few years, and your leadership and contribution to the sector is invaluable. John is a structural engineer by background. He has a wide range of experience in both public and private sector. He's extensive experience in development, provision and direct delivery of housing, particularly in the area of social housing, affordable housing and regeneration projects. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to focus is on some of the key challenges that face us in relation to housing. Gemma, can we all see the slides at this stage?
Yes, we can see them.
Hello, John. Yes, I think we're good.
Okay. In terms of just the key challenges for housing. So the first thing, and most importantly of all, is that we need to create good places for people to live. And we talk about that a lot, but I'd just like you all to think about that. What can we do to create good places to live, create integrated communities, where people are living and working together? That has to be our first overall focus. And we need to have cohesion between people of all age groups within our communities. Sorcha spoke about getting community involvement and community engagement, and it is so critical to achieving what we do need to achieve. And in terms of some of the key elements in terms of creating those good places to live, it's about ensuring that housing, employment, all services are linked together, and that we have got sufficient density to support the provision of social services, support the provision of infrastructure. So particularly in Ireland, we do need to focus more on making our cities, our towns, our villages work better, and to strengthen the communities in those areas. Just moving in terms of some of the key challenges we're facing at the moment. We have two black swan events happening at the one time, which is very unusual in terms of one black swan is rare, but having two together, particularly unrare. So we have COVID-19 and the effects that it's having worldwide on everyone, but also it'll have long-term effects. It'll change the way we work, it'll change the way we live into the future. We also have Brexit, and irrespective of whether it's a hard or a soft Brexit, it will still have a significant effect and we need to step up to the challenge to ensure that we're meeting the housing needs of the country. I'm just going to list out some of the key challenges. Affordability. Both Sorka and Wilhelm mentioned affordability as the really key issue, and Sorka showed a very dramatic slide in terms of the increasing lack of affordability in housing in terms of income versus house prices, both house prices to rent or to buy. So that is the key thing that we need to address, and is a key focus of the housing agency. The high housing costs. Again, renting homes in many parts of the country, and the price of homes is just simply too high. And we need to understand that is not a good thing. We need to have lower rents, we need to have lower house prices, and that is in the interest of our society. Mortgage arrears, often not raised enough. Personally, I think it's still the single biggest housing problem in the country. It doesn't get sufficient attention. Currently we have 134,000 households that are in mortgage arrears or have restructured mortgages. So they have very significant amount of households have difficulties, and specifically 26,000 households are in mortgage arrears for more than 2 years. And in reality, those households are facing repossession of their homes. So it's a really critical issue that we need to address. The housing agency specifically work in relation to the area of mortgage to rent. We need to work on that area, but even broader than that, we need to assist people that are in arrears, both financially, but even more importantly, psychologically. Our aging population. We are having very dramatic changes in Ireland in terms of the demographics of our population. Within 10 years, the number of people over the age of 80 in Ireland will double from what it is today. So very dramatic. And that's just one of many demographic changes. I've often showed this slide before, and we need to understand the demographics in the country, that 70% of all households in the country are for 3 persons or less. So we need to take that into account in terms of providing the homes that are needed. The cost of building. Our costs of building and the cost of provision of homes is still way too high, and we need to find ways of reducing those costs, and we all need to look at that. Homelessness. We still have serious issues of homelessness for single people and for families throughout the country. There's a lot being done, but we need to continue to focus on supporting people in homelessness. And the most important thing is providing homes and housing first. We'll have a session later in the week focusing on homelessness, as we have a session focusing on affordability. And the other thing, and to touch back on the issue I raised earlier, is creating sustainable and integrated communities. There are words that we use, but we really need to think about what we're doing. Is it sustainable? And we should all ask our question in relation to anything we're doing. Is it sustainable? Are we achieving integrated communities? Again, Sorka gave us some very good ideas in relation to creating that integration. Just for everybody's information, the full name of the housing agency is the Housing and Sustainable Communities Agency. And that sustainable communities is a key element of what we want to achieve. Many countries around Europe have a much better integration of housing within their cities, within their towns, within their villages, and it's something that we should learn from. This is an example from Spain, but we need to get much better integration. Some key elements of specifically in relation to social sustainability, is having social equity and having sustainable communities. And the most important thing is social cohesion, getting cohesion within our society. And again, we need to strive towards bringing our homes back into our towns and cities. It's something we have lost over the decades, but we need to bring our homes back into our towns, cities and villages, and creating vibrant communities. Just touching very briefly on the programme for government, the housing part of the housing part of the programme for government is named Housing for All, and it's a very important aspiration. Actually, the title Housing for All came from a programme that was introduced in Sweden after the war, a long-term policy that all housing was integrated and of all income groups and of all people. In terms of the key elements of the programme for government in terms of housing is overall housing supply, and we still need a greater level of housing supply than we're achieving. And that's needed in terms of providing affordability and meeting the needs of the people in the country. We need sustainability, and we need to ensure what we're doing is viable. Just touching on two areas in the programme for government, they're going to be dealt with in a session later this week. Affordable home purchase, that's affordable homes provided by local authorities using various funds, specifically the Service Sites Fund, and the introduction of a shared equity home purchase scheme. So we need to support people into home ownership where appropriate, and we need to ensure that system of providing affordable housing is equitable for all in society. So we provide supports where people need it, but it's done in an equitable way. Also, there's a big push in the programme for government in relation to cost rental housing. This is one development in Step Aside in Dublin, and it's 155 homes, and 50 of those will be cost rental. But we need to build cost rental on a much bigger scale. Again, in the programme for government, funding is being provided to approved housing bodies there, the housing associations, to provide more cost rental homes, and it's by way of providing the cost rental equity loan coupled with long-term finance in terms of achieving that cost rental housing and achieving affordable rents that meet a bigger number of people in society. And just two slides then to wrap up with. Ireland signed up to the UN Charter on Sustainable Housing. And what's that about is providing access to decent, adequate, affordable and healthy housing for all. And it's something we need to focus on. And a number of the key elements of that are listed there. I'll just pick out one that often isn't considered, is cultural adequacy. In terms of providing our homes, developing our towns and cities, we need to ensure that it's culturally appropriate to our society. And then just one last point to finish with, and I'd just like you all to consider it in relation to any of the work you're doing, is the importance of shared spaces. And I think we more appreciate them now during COVID-19, all those shared spaces and the importance of shared spaces for society, where all generations can integrate, where activities and amenities are all brought together. We need to focus on ensuring what we're providing is within developments and within our towns and cities that are walkable, because it's so important, particularly for vulnerable generations. We need to really focus on our shared spaces, and then we focus on development a lot and provision of housing, but we need to focus on our shared spaces, provide them, enhance them, have them better integrate into what we do. And then we need to ensure that anything new that we're providing integrates seamlessly into what's existing. So if there's one message I'd have for you is connect, and focus on those shared spaces for all of us, so we can all integrate together and have a cohesive society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that, and for, I think, pulling together a lot of the key issues that we're addressing this morning. We now have 15 or 20 minutes available to us to take some questions. We have some questions in on the system, but can I encourage more of you to contribute, and we'll try and get through a good number of them as we go through the next 15 minutes or so. I'll do my best to pick out the more meaningful ones as we're going. We're doing this live, clearly, so bear with me. The first question that's highlighted here is in relation to how European countries have developed forms of residential engagement, how to engage with the communities. I think this is one probably for Sorka. Sorka, can you share how you think some of the community participation developments could work on a larger scale, or could work particularly in Ireland?
I think the example of Denmark is a particularly impressive one, where you have a real role for tenants in the running of estates and the management of the housing itself. So a tenants' democracy, and this has been an established part of the system for some time now, and it definitely is something that Ireland could perhaps draw some lessons from, because you see estates integrating people of all ages, and the residents really taking part in the running of those. Now what we start to see in systems which perhaps don't have such a don't have this established tenants democracy as part of their system, we see as part of the energy transition, a crucial way to bring people on board is actually to bring them into the planning of the renovation process itself. And even more convincingly, we see in Flanders actually tenants being brought in as owners of the local energy system, so owners of their own PV panels on rental housing. So up till before the social housing providers installed PV, or now they're in the process of installing them, it was really exclusive to homeowners. So we do see that actually genuinely bringing people in as owners of the generated energy also can bring a larger sense of ownership more broadly in the estate. The Danish one definitely stands out.
Okay, great, thank you. Wilhelm, there's a number of questions here around the role that housing can play in addressing social disadvantage, and in your report there's some reference to mobility challenges where people become trapped in social housing. Some of our schemes in Ireland seek to address that. What can we learn from some of the initiatives around the OECD countries in terms of, for example, in the UK, the Right to Move initiative, or other international examples around social mobility?
Thanks for the question. I mean, you obviously have got access to all sorts of questions which I can't see, and the ones that I can see are not being put to me. But I'll deal with those too. It's very, very good. On the mobility issue, I mean, it's related to that issue of trying to find a balance in your universalist approach towards social housing and trying to cover a large group. And trying to target your support on a much smaller group. The big issue in the Netherlands is that people with a certain decent amount of income still live in social housing, and while they may have satisfied all eligibility criteria when they entered social housing, their income and earnings have increased in the course of the years, and they may no longer be eligible for social housing. So in the Netherlands, the issue is to get the right through flow through the social housing stock. It's a very tricky issue. You want people to have incentives to earn more. So you don't want them to get bogged down in low income groups. What can you do? You want to introduce periodic eligibility reviews. Could be costly. May not be all that easy in view of the administrative data. Would you introduce income-dependent rent increases? Is another alternative. Again, would be not without its administrative challenges to get that right. Or in the UK, in England, the fixed term rent, fixed term tenancies. So, but all these measures have their drawbacks too. So I don't find it very easy to come up with a very simple and straightforward answer and say, right, this is the best way forward. I think it also depends a bit on the housing history of the country at hand. I would like to address a question that John put on the chat. Will the OECD be interested in social and affordable housing in the years to come? The answer is yes, as far as I can help it. But in our program of work and budget, we have already lined up future work on housing review in Lithuania, on the updates of the affordable housing database. And although this isn't the budget isn't finally sealed off yet, that will happen at the end of the year, we are hoping to have to continue our OECD-wide work on housing with all directorates in future. So yes, and in terms of how can you provide inputs, when we draft a document like we did with the social housing review, we send it to countries for comment. So sooner or later it lands with the ministry responsible for housing, and they will provide comment if they feel the need.
Thank you, Willem, in addressing my question and some of the other questions at the same time. Very efficient. Thank you. There's a number of questions, 2 or 3 questions appearing here in relation to the role of the private sector in provision of social housing. Perhaps John could comment on that in an Irish context, but both Sorcha and Wilhelm comment on how it works across other markets in terms of the private sector involvement in the provision of social housing, or relative to the public sector provision directly. John, do you want to take that to start?
Yes, thanks, Michael. First of all, in terms of the private sector involvement in provision is in relation to even the construction market. Like, all of our housing is constructed by the private sector through contractors and developers. I think that's maybe just important to note. In terms of getting more heavily involved in terms of funding and delivery of social housing, it's one, often working with approved housing bodies or local authorities in relation to developments that they have planning permission for and can take through for social housing provision. It can be through the provisions on private developments, which is called Part 5, where there's a requirement currently to provide 10% social housing. And then there's facility for the private sector to provide social housing through leasing. And one of the reasons, for the government supporting that is that the government is limited on the capital funding available to it. So in terms of delivering more social housing, social leasing arrangements are used. And also then in terms of the approved housing bodies, there's ongoing current and capital funding used to provide housing. So that's just a very quick overview, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Sorka,
Yeah.
the European perspective?
Yeah. If I can just jump on quickly on the last question about being trapped in social housing. I mean, obviously, if we have to look at more broadly at the housing offer available, and very often, if there is no choice, so the ideal scenario is where people actually have a choice to move if they wish, and very often the market is actually not supplying an affordable choice, and people are stuck between, let's say, eligibility for social housing and actual prices on the market. So I think that is a key reason so why we have to look at the entire housing market. And instead of, I think the focus also is how to give people those choices to ensure that we have good access to education and equal opportunities in those neighbourhoods, so that indeed people are empowered to leave if they wish. And on the role of the private sector, I mean, I think we also have to be careful. There's so many of the limited profit or cooperative housing providers in Europe that are providing the cost rental or social equivalent homes are indeed not public entities. They're very often private entities that are regulated. And if we look the Austrian situation, these are limited profit housing cooperatives. And when the city puts out a tender for the delivery of housing, that is open to all types of entities, but it obviously depends on what margins you're willing to work under. And if you are obviously aiming at maximizing a profit, you might not be willing to work under the conditions specified by the tender. So it is not always the case that when we talk about social housing or cooperative housing, that we talk about public or private, and that's very important. And I think it comes through also in the last OECD study. And yes, it's all about margins and it's value for money for the public purse. If housing is being bought, let's say built by private entities but bought back at market prices by local authorities, then you have to ask yourself is that value for money for public, and is it sustainable? So yes, it's about what margins are to be expected and limiting those margins through regulation.
Okay, thank you. There's again a couple of questions around the issue that was raised in some of the papers this morning about investment in upgrading the current stock of housing and the role of renovating housing stock to make them more environmentally sustainable. Particular question around the focus on social housing, how that can play a role in achieving our targets, and what examples are there from international markets of the retrofitting or regeneration of social housing. Anybody like to take that question?
Oh, I can say a few words on that. Actually, on the previous question, just thinking about it while talking, with the crisis, with the COVID-19 pandemic, you will see an increase in demand for social and affordable housing, and there may well be a role to play for the private sector to try and address that demand. Regulated by the government, certainly, but you won't be able to build stock just like that. So you may have to think creatively about regulations to bring in existing private rental stock or existing home-owned stock to help address the social housing issue. On the experience with upgrading of social and affordable housing. One of the examples we ran into while working on Latvia was the experience of the Slovak Republic, where they, over the years, have put up a sort of revolving fund, which reinvests the money they raise, the long-term loans at a low cost, and reinvest the rents from apartments back into the housing sector. Over the years, they have, and you know, in 1990 or just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the housing stock was privatized, but not a lot was done to upkeep the quality of the stock. So they have invested fairly heavily in upgrading the stock. So that is one way of investing in more environmentally friendly public housing.
If you want me to just add to that, I think they're really good examples, Willem, that we've also seen in Slovakia with the revolving fund and Estonia. And then maybe also what's crucial, I think going to be a really crucial part of this puzzle is the hybrid methods with prefabricated solutions to renovation, so prefabricated toolkits. We're seeing a system called Energy Sprung, which is prefabricating the new facades off-site and installing those over even a 10-day period with new kitchens and PV and ventilation inbuilt, with the risk being transferred to the construction companies. We've seen that being rolled out in France last week by a number of different social housing providers, and the idea actually came from the Netherlands as well. So we see that the social housing sector, because of its scale, can really have some potential in upscaling new approaches, and approaches which maybe will also reduce. Obviously, we're seeing already the pressure on the workforce, so this would potentially reduce some of that pressure as the scale of the retrofit kicks off to the scale that we need. But I think there's now 750 billion euro on the table, as we've spoken about before, from the EU recovery plan. And Willem, you mentioned the Green Deal and what is called the renovation wave. And we've been quite pleased with also Kieran Cuff's work on that, in saying that, listen, social housing is really a good place to start there, because you're investing because you're keeping, let's say, you're giving people lower bills, keeping money in the local community, you're generating employment as well. So a lot of that, as Willem said, it's an investment, it's often not a cost, because a lot of that investment is going to come back because of the jobs being generated. So I mean, we're really arguing that it's a good place to invest and to use part of that recovery plan. So from the perspective of making sure low income groups are brought, but also from the perspective of scaling up those renovation systems, so to bring the construction sector up to speed, because it's one of the weak points.
Thank you, Sorka. John?
Yeah, Michael, to add on that, in terms of the energy retrofit, yes, in terms of the social housing, both local authorities and approved housing bodies have a huge opportunity, in terms of carrying out retrofitting on scale, because, they have housing or apartments that are all, in one development, and they do need to lead in terms of what Sorka said, in terms of prefabricated solutions, and lead the way in terms of what can be done, because I think if it can be shown to be done on those larger developments of social housing, well, then it's something then can be maybe replicated into the private sector, rather than trying to do one at a time individual houses, which is cost a lot of money and take a long time. So I think that, the sector needs to lead, but be innovative in terms of how it does its retrofitting.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. I'm trying to keep them fairly broad, European, where the European and international perspective can help us. A question on the role of social housing in the overall context of housing supply. The Irish population has expressed a very high support for home ownership. Where that is the case in other countries, that tends to squeeze down the proportion of social housing. Is there an appropriate balance for Ireland as one question, and another connected question to that is, given the ongoing need for social housing for a significant proportion of Ireland's population, should we continue to deplete the current stock via tenant purchase options? And are there any examples where that works or has a major impact, or it doesn't work in other countries that we should learn from? Sorka, you're nodding.
Sure, yeah.
Please.
Should I go in, or Willem, you want to?
Please, thank you.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So I'm definitely, as you know, EU doesn't have competence to dictate to countries what their tenure mix should be, and Housing Europe definitely doesn't either. What we are doing is supporting those housing providers that are working ways to make sure that the framework is optimized for them. But what we do see is that sometimes we enter into this this sort of bit theoretical debate: what is better, home ownership or rental? But we see that bigger and bigger proportions of the population are renting, and they're paying too much of their income on rent, on those rents. So it is what is clear is that you need more responsible landlords in the rental sector, and a bigger number of affordable rental housing. And I think that it's difficult to escape that fact, even if, and what is happening, I think, in many markets is then the amount of investment, amount of money going into rents is then preventing people from potentially accessing ownership if that should be their choice. So I think it really depends on each market, each situation on the ground. I think this is why we're always stressing, also as part of the 2030 study, the importance of evidence as a basis of your housing strategy, and why also the affordable housing database of OECD is so valuable. Then in terms of tenant purchasing, we're actually just completing a study on the sale of social housing and how that has, the impact that has had. So obviously where the purchase has been taken away a large portion of the stock, and where that stock has not been replaced, you do see a situation where then you have a lack of tools then for local authorities to provide housing for those in need, and to put a balance the market. So I think what we've put together as part of our observatory that will be launched coming soon, I'll share the date with you, John, looking at different ways you could handle the sale of social housing so that it doesn't damage the availability of housing more generally, so that it's replaced, or that you could look at potential selling into cooperative models. But in many situations it hasn't led to a desirable situation. It's led to gentrification, and it's unfortunately, in many cases, it's been a way to raise funds by local authorities at a very short term, with a very short-term vision, and hasn't resulted in an optimal outcome then when it comes to accommodating groups which require lower rents. But we'll keep you informed on the launch of that study.
Okay, thank you, Sorka. Wilhelm, I know you have to go on to another call in just 1 or 2 minutes. Final comments around that issue on the mix?
Well, very quickly. I mean, European, but also non-European OECD countries all have very different housing histories, and there is a cultural aspect to this all. Me coming from the Netherlands, I've never understood why the Irish, the English, and the Norwegians were so desperate to buy their own home. And they start thinking about this when they're 20, 21. I mean, as a postgraduate teacher in Oxford, I was baffled when a student who just graduated told me, now I have to buy a house. The kid was 21. It was amazing. But in the current climate, where in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, I can only see the demand for social housing increase. So I don't think this is the right time to start discussing the sell of existing social housing stock. I'm awfully sorry. I gotta go.
Thank you,
I've got another meeting to attend. I thank you very much for inviting me to present, and I hope to talk to you guys in future.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Wilhelm.
Nice to see you, Willem.
Perhaps John, just as we're finishing, thank you, Wilhelm. We'll assume you're going. John, just to finish, do you want to comment on the social housing supply issue?
I think the one thing we have to do, Michael, is focusing on providing particularly kind of rental housing for that intermediate group to give people, you know, more choices, because the pressure on home ownership is because of the lack of availability of affordable rental housing. So I think that the countries that have been successful are the ones that have a kind of a larger stock of affordable rental housing. So you haven't got the 21 and 22-year-olds seeking to buy a home. So I think that's just the one point I'd make.
Okay. Okay, thank you to Wilhelm in his absence, to Sorka, to John, thank you for participating. To the attendees at on this webinar, you will receive an email with a link to all of the presentations that have been made, including the full version of the Minister's video. Apologies again to the Minister and also to the attendees for the technical problem on that. But that will be sent out to you in an email form. Thank you for your participation. I look forward to joining in the other sessions during the week. If they're all at this standard of input, I think we'll have done very well. So thank you, Wilhelm. Thank you, Sorka. Thank you, John. And have a good day.
Thanks, Michael. See you, Sorka.